Minori had chosen the attic because it was the last place she thought anyone would look. Hidden among old trunks, dusty furniture, and boxes that had remained untouched for years, she sat with one hand clasped tightly around the cup of salt water while listening to footsteps moving through the floor below. At first, they sounded distant, wandering aimlessly through the old house, but with each passing moment, they grew louder, until eventually they reached the staircase leading towards the attic. She held her breath. Every account she had read about playing Hitori Kakurenbo, also known as one-man hide-and-seek, had warned that if the ritual for it worked, the seeker would eventually come looking for you. The footsteps stopped outside the attic door. At that moment, Minori realized she was no longer playing a game. Welcome to Edenfold. This is your host, Lavelle. Tonight, I'll be taking you to a quiet Japanese island for a story that I have refrained from fully sharing ever since I heard it. It centers around one of Japan's most infamous paranormal rituals, a ritual known as Hitori Kakurenbo, or one-man hide-and-seek. In 1998, on a Japanese online bulletin board called Amezo, an early predecessor to 2channel, an anonymous user shared their experience of playing this game. It is likely the earliest Hitori Kakurenbo experience posted online, and I just happen to know the person who did it. With respect, their identity is guarded, but the retelling is as they described. So, if you're ready, turn down the lights and come with me. Like many people with a fascination for the paranormal, Minori had spent years reading stories that most of her friends shrugged off without a second thought. Ghost sightings, haunted places, cursed objects, and unexplained encounters fascinated her, not because she believed every word she read, but because she couldn't bring herself to believe that every story was false either. Somewhere between blind belief and outright skepticism was a place where curiosity thrived, and that was exactly where Minori found herself. She discovered Hitori Kakurenbo late one evening in the form of a post from an anonymous user while browsing an online Japanese paranormal bulletin board on Amazo. At first glance, it appeared to be little more than another strange internet challenge, but the more she read, the stranger it became. Unlike so many rituals that relied on little more than a candle or a whispered phrase, this one demanded preparation. It asked participants to create something, to follow a series of precise instructions, and to invite an unseen presence into a child's doll before playing a solitary game of hide-and-seek. All she could see were the instructions and multiple comments from other anonymous users saying that they were either too afraid to try it or that they thought it was just a waste of time and a prank. Over the following weeks, she found herself returning to the subject again and again. Whenever she had spare time, she searched for more information online, comparing different versions of the ritual and making notes whenever details overlapped. Although there were small differences between them, the core of the ritual remained remarkably consistent. That consistency only made her curiosity grow stronger. Eventually, she stopped asking herself whether it was real. Instead, she began wondering what would happen if someone followed the ritual exactly as it had been described. The opportunity presented itself sooner than she expected. Every summer, Minori traveled to visit her grandparents, who lived on a small island off the coast of Japan. It was the sort of place where life moved at its own gentle pace. Fishing boats drifted out before sunrise, neighbors greeted one another by name, and as evening approached, the island gradually surrendered itself to silence. She had always loved visiting as a child. The island felt like a world apart from the city. There were no crowded streets or constant traffic, only narrow lanes, quiet homes, and the endless sound of the sea carried inland by the wind and drifting through the treetops, where it met with the distinctive summer sound of cicadas. Days were peaceful, often spent helping her grandparents around the house or exploring woodland paths she had known since she was old enough to walk. After sunset, however, the island became something altogether different. Darkness arrived quickly, and with so few streetlights, the night seemed deeper than anything she experienced back home. Once the last lights disappeared from neighboring houses, the silence became almost complete. The only sounds that remained were the distant waves, the wind passing through the trees, and the occasional groan of old timber as her grandparents' house settled for the night. The house itself had stood there for decades. It wasn't abandoned or neglected. It was a warm family home, filled with photographs, heirlooms, and memories. But age had left its unmistakable mark. Wooden floorboards creaked beneath every step. Sliding doors shifted softly whenever the weather changed, and almost every room carried the comforting scent of polished timber and tatami mats. It was the sort of place where every sound had become so familiar that nobody living there paid it much attention anymore. For Minori, it seemed like the perfect place to attempt the ritual. If Hitori Kakurenbo was nothing more than an elaborate ghost story, then nothing would happen, and she would return home with little more than an embarrassing tale to laugh about later. But if there was a chance the game was real, there was no other place more suited to do this than her grandparents' home once darkness settled across the island. Minori had arrived on the island carrying more than just an overnight bag. Tucked safely inside her luggage was a small cloth doll she had bought several days before making the journey. She had chosen it carefully. Every version of Hitori Kakurenbo she had read insisted that it should be a doll with arms and legs, something that resembled the person as closely as possible. The one she eventually settled on was simple, with black stitched eyes, short dark hair made of wool, and a plain cotton dress. Very cute, in fact. Nothing creepy about it. At least, not yet. Throughout the afternoon, while her grandparents went about their usual routine and neighbors passed by outside on bicycles or stopped to exchange greetings over garden fences, Minori remained quietly in her bedroom with the door closed. Spread out across the floor in front of her were the items she would need. A small sewing kit, a packet of uncooked rice, bright red thread, a cup half filled with salt, a pair of scissors, and a kitchen knife she intended to return before anyone noticed it was missing. Every object had its place, and every step would need to be completed before 3 o'clock the following morning. Taking a slow breath, she picked up the doll and carefully turned it over in her hands. It still felt ridiculous, not frightening, just strange. Using the scissors, she gently unpicked the stitching running along the doll's back until she was able to reach inside. Handful by handful, she removed the soft white stuffing, placing it neatly beside her until nothing remained inside except an empty shell of fabric. The instructions were very clear about what came next. The empty space was slowly filled with uncooked rice, pressed carefully into the doll's arms, legs, and body until it became firm once again. Rice was believed to invite wandering spirits, transforming the doll into an ordinary toy into a vessel capable of housing something otherworldly. The final addition was something from herself. Minori paused for a moment before pulling several strands of her hair from her brush. It seemed like such an insignificant thing, yet every version of the ritual stressed that a personal item was essential. It created a connection between the participant and the doll, binding the two together for the duration of the game. She tucked the strands carefully inside before picking up the needle. Working slowly, she stitched the opening closed using the bright red thread. Once the seam had disappeared, she continued wrapping the remaining thread around the doll until thin crimson lines bound its body in a crisscross pattern. Only an hour earlier, it had looked like something that belonged on the shelf of a child's bedroom. Now, sitting silently on the wooden floor in front of her, it carried a presence that was altogether eerie. There was one final thing the doll needed: a name. The ritual warned against using your own. Instead, Minori chose the name Hana. Holding the doll in both hands, she looked into its stitched black eyes and quietly spoke the name aloud. Hana-chan. Saying it out loud made the entire process feel suddenly more real. From that moment on, the doll was no longer simply a doll. It was Hana-chan. By the time she had finished, the afternoon sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky, so Minori carefully gathered everything together before hiding the sewing kit, the loose stuffing, and the scraps of thread at the bottom of her travel bag.
The only things she left untouched were Hana-chan, the kitchen knife, and the cup of salt, each of which would be needed before the night was over.
As evening settled across the island, life continued exactly as it always had. Her grandmother prepared dinner while her grandfather sat watching television, occasionally commenting on the local news or asking Minori about life back in the city. They ate together around the small wooden table, talking about family, neighbors, and the upcoming summer festival as though it were any other visit. All the while, Minori's thoughts kept drifting upstairs. She found herself glancing at the clock more often than she realized, mentally counting the hours that still separated her from the ritual. Every time she looked, it seemed as though the hands had barely moved. Once dinner was over, she helped clear the table before stepping outside for a while. The evening air carried the familiar scent of the sea, and somewhere beyond the neighboring houses she could hear the rhythmic knocking of ropes against the masts of fishing boats returning to harbor. A warm breeze stirred the leaves overhead, and for a few quiet moments she wondered whether she should simply leave everything where it was and forget the ritual entirely. Nothing was forcing her to go through with it. Hana-chan could easily be emptied, stitched back together properly, and thrown away before anyone ever knew what she had planned. The thought lingered only briefly. Curiosity had brought her this far, and curiosity refused to let her turn back now. As darkness settled over the island, one house after another began switching off its lights. The quiet roads outside emptied. Distant conversations faded. Eventually, only the occasional barking dog or the distant crash of waves against the shoreline disturbed the silence. Inside, her grandparents retired to bed shortly before midnight, wishing her good night as they climbed the stairs. Minori waited until she was certain the house had fallen silent before leaving her room. The clock on the wall read a little after 2:30 in the morning. Everything was ready. There was no reason to delay any longer. Carrying Hana-chan gently under her arm, a flashlight in one hand and the cup of salt water in the other, Minori left her bedroom, careful to avoid the floorboards she knew had a habit of creaking. She had walked these corridors every summer since she was a little girl, and knew the old house well enough to move through it almost by memory, even in near darkness. At the far end of the hallway, her grandparents remained fast asleep in their bedroom, completely unaware that their granddaughter was quietly carrying out a ritual she had spent weeks preparing for. Before heading downstairs to the bathroom, she made one final stop. Earlier that evening, she had already chosen the place where she intended to hide once the game began. The small attic above the first floor was rarely used except for storing old family belongings, and reaching it meant climbing a narrow wooden staircase hidden behind a sliding door at the end of the hallway. It was cramped, dusty, and uncomfortably warm during the summer months, but it offered enough space for her to sit out of sight if the ritual unfolded as she expected. She climbed the stairs, allowing her eyes to adjust to the darkness. Kneeling beside an old wooden trunk, she carefully placed a cup containing the salt water where she could reach it easily without making unnecessary noise. She studied the attic for a few moments, mentally noting exactly where she would sit and where she would place the flashlight if she needed both hands free. The ritual had warned against wandering around the house once the game was underway, so she wanted everything ready before it began. Satisfied, she made her way downstairs. The bathroom light seemed unusually bright after walking through the dark hallway. Closing the door quietly behind her, she rested Hana-chan on the edge of the sink before turning on the cold tap. Water flowed steadily into the basin until there was enough to cover the doll completely. As she lifted Hana-chan for what she hoped would be the last time before the game began, she found herself looking at its stitched face for a little longer than she intended. Only that afternoon, it had looked like an ordinary toy. Now, wrapped tightly in red thread and filled with rice and her own hair, it felt extremely macabre. Whether that feeling came from the ritual itself or from everything she had read during the previous weeks, she couldn't have said. But she no longer found it quite so easy to look at the doll as simply a doll. Drawing a slow breath, she spoke the words exactly as she had memorized them. For the first round, Minori is it. She repeated this a second time, then a third. Only after the final words left her lips did she lower Hana-chan gently into the water.
The little cloth body floated for a moment before slowly becoming saturated, its dress darkening as it absorbed the cold water, until the doll settled just beneath the surface. Minori didn't linger. The next steps needed to follow one another without hesitation. Leaving Hana-chan where it was, she stepped out into the hallway and quietly closed the bathroom door behind her. Standing in the hallway, Minori reached for the television remote and switched the set on. After cycling through several channels, the familiar hiss of static suddenly filled the room, the gray flickering screen casting an uneven glow across the walls and tatami floor. She left it exactly as it was. One by one, she moved through the house, switching off every light she came to. The living room disappeared into darkness first, followed by the kitchen, then the hallway. By the time she reached the final switch, the only light remaining came from the weak beam of her flashlight and the pale shimmer of the television screen further down the corridor. The atmosphere inside the house changed immediately. It wasn't that anything looked different. Every piece of furniture remained where it had always been, and every doorway opened into rooms she had known since childhood. Yet without the familiar glow of the lights, the house felt strangely hollow, its long hallway fading into shadow beyond the reach of her torch. Remembering the next part of the ritual, Minori switched off the flashlight and slipped it into her pocket. She closed her eyes, standing perfectly still in complete darkness as the steady hiss of television static echoed through the house. Then she began to count. 1, 2, 3. She forced herself not to rush, allowing each number to come at a natural pace. And by the time she reached 10, she could hear her own heartbeat more clearly than the static. Opening her eyes, she took the flashlight from her pocket and switched it back on. The narrow beam cut through the darkness ahead of her as she made her way back towards the bathroom, her footsteps slow and deliberate against the old wooden floor.
She paused outside the bathroom door for only a moment before pulling it open. The room looked exactly as she had left it. Hana-chan was still lying beneath the surface of the water. Stepping closer to the basin, she raised the flashlight until its beam settled on the doll and quietly spoke the next words exactly as she had memorized them. "Hana-chan, I found you." She repeated the words a second time, then a third. Carefully reaching into the cold water, she lifted the doll from the basin. Water streamed from its soaked body as she held it over the sink, the red thread clinging tightly to the darkened fabric while droplets fell steadily back into the water below. For just a moment, Minori held Hana-chan in both hands. The doll felt surprisingly heavy now that the rice inside had absorbed the water, and as droplets continued to fall into the basin below, she found herself staring once again at its stitched face. It was exactly the same face she had looked at earlier that afternoon, yet after everything she had done over the past several hours, it no longer felt like an ordinary toy. Tightening her grip on the knife, she drew its point towards the center of Hana-chan's chest. The blade passed through the soaked fabric and into the tightly packed rice with a muted resistance that traveled through the handle and into her hand. She withdrew the knife and lowered Hana-chan back into the water, allowing the doll to drift slowly away from her before settling once more beneath the surface. Looking down into the basin, Minori spoke the final words of the ritual, exactly as she had memorized them. "Hana-chan, now you're it." She repeated the phrase a second time, then a third. Without another glance towards the basin, Minori turned, slipped the flashlight back into her hand, and hurried out into the hallway. She pushed the bathroom door closed behind her and immediately made her way upstairs and towards the narrow staircase leading up to the small attic space, conscious that from this point onwards, the ritual instructed her to quickly hide. The television continued to hiss somewhere behind her, its flickering light spilling faintly across the hallway as she climbed the stairs two at a time. Although she resisted the temptation to look back, she found herself becoming acutely aware of every sound she made, every careful footstep on the wooden stairs, every quiet breath, every brush of clothing against the wall. Reaching the attic, she slid the door closed as gently as she could before lowering herself into the space beside the old wooden trunk where she had left the cup of salt water earlier that evening.
Only then did she switch off the flashlight, allowing the darkness to settle around her. Minori remained perfectly still, allowing her breathing to settle as she listened to the sounds of the house below. She had expected her imagination to race, but instead, she found herself concentrating on ordinary things: the rough wood beneath her hands, the faint smell of old cedar wood and dust that always lingered in the attic, and the uncomfortable pressure in her knees from crouching in such a confined space. Several minutes passed, but she had no idea exactly how long, only that it felt much longer than it probably was. Then, from somewhere outside the house, a dog began barking. The sound carried clearly through the still night air. At first, she paid it no mind. The island was home to plenty of dogs, and hearing one bark after dark was hardly out of place. The thing that began to send shivers up her spine was that it did not stop. The barking continued without pause, becoming more frantic with each passing moment, until it sounded less like an animal reacting to another dog, and more like one that became fixated on something it couldn't understand, or something it feared. Minori found herself listening intently, trying to work out where it was coming from. It sounded close enough that she wondered whether it belonged to one of the neighboring houses. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped, and the silence that followed seemed heavier than the barking.
Minori became aware that she was holding her breath. Slowly, she let it out again and shifted her attention back towards the house, acutely aware but not expecting to hear anything. Instead, she caught another sound. It was faint enough that at first she couldn't be certain she had heard anything at all. A soft creak, the sort of sound an old wooden floor might make when somebody placed their weight upon it. She remained absolutely still, straining to listen. Another creak followed. This one sounded closer. Minori held her breath and listened. The creaking stopped. For several long seconds there was nothing at all, and she began to wonder whether the sound had simply been the old timber settling as the night air cooled the house. She had heard the floorboards creak before during previous visits, especially in older parts of the building, and she silently scolded herself for becoming so tense over something so ordinary. Then it happened again. This time it wasn't a single creak, it was two. The unmistakable sound of weight shifting across the floor. Minori felt the muscles in her shoulders tighten. She remained crouched beside the old trunk, frozen, every instinct telling her to stay exactly where she was. Her grandparents were asleep downstairs, at least they should have been. She listened for the sound of a bedroom door sliding open or someone clearing their throat, hoping for some ordinary explanation that would immediately put her mind at ease. None came. Instead, another floorboard complained beneath what sounded like a slow, deliberate step. Then another. The movement was unhurried, calm. Whoever or whatever was walking through the house didn't sound as though it was wandering aimlessly. There was a rhythm to it that immediately reminded Minori of the game she had started only minutes earlier. The seeker was supposed to look for the person hiding. The attic suddenly felt much smaller than it had when she chose it earlier that evening, wedged between old boxes and pieces of furniture that had been stored away years before. She had nowhere else to go if someone opened the sliding door at the top of the stairs. The footsteps continued for what felt like several minutes, sometimes becoming faint enough that she thought they had stopped altogether before returning somewhere else in the house. Then she realized something that made her stomach tighten. They no longer seemed to be downstairs. She couldn't explain why she thought that, but she was suddenly aware that the sounds were different now, closer. She found herself staring towards the attic entrance, barely visible in the darkness, listening so intensely that even the darkness around her seemed to have its own voice. Another creak. This one came from the attic staircase. Minori's pulse quickened and she counted silently as she listened. One step,
A pause, then another. Each sound seemed to come from a little higher up the staircase than the last. She pressed herself back against a wall without even realizing she was doing it, clutching the cup of salt water so tightly that she was afraid she might spill it. The footsteps stopped as they reached the top of the stairs. She knew someone, or something, was standing on the other side of the sliding door, silently waiting. The footsteps never came any closer. Minori remained where she was, scarcely daring to breathe as she stared towards the attic door, waiting for it to slide open. Every instinct told her to stay absolutely still, convinced that the slightest movement would somehow betray where she was hiding. Nothing happened. The silence stretched on until it became almost impossible to judge how much time had passed. 10? 15 minutes? Little by little, the tension that had held her body rigid began to loosen. Her breathing slowed. Her pulse settled. Just over 15 minutes had passed since she had climbed into the attic. She let out a slow breath through her nose and shook her head at herself. It was ridiculous. She had spent weeks reading frightening stories written by strangers on the internet, convincing herself that she was about to invite something supernatural into her grandparents' home. Then, after hearing a few creaking floorboards and a dog barking somewhere outside, she had hidden herself away in a dusty attic, clutching a cup of salt water as though it were the only thing keeping her alive. The more she thought about it, the more embarrassed she felt. The noise she had heard could have been anything. An old house settled constantly throughout the night, and there was no shortage of pet dogs in the neighborhood. Once she had hidden herself away, her imagination had simply taken over, weaving ordinary sounds into something far more sinister than they really were. She had fallen for exactly the kind of stories she would normally have laughed at. A faint smile crept across her face as she reached for the flashlight resting beside her. Enough was enough. She picked up the cup of salt water with her other hand before carefully climbing to her feet. According to the ritual, she should have taken a mouthful of salt water before leaving her hiding place, but by now, the idea seemed almost laughable. If nothing else, the past 15 minutes had convinced her that the ritual was nothing more than an elaborate ghost tale passed around online to frighten curious people into believing they could experience something extraordinary. There was no point pretending otherwise. The game was over, and she managed to give herself a good Japanese summer scare. Sliding the attic door open, Minori stepped quietly onto the landing and made her way back downstairs. The television was still hissing somewhere below, and she sighed to herself as she headed towards the bathroom, already thinking about emptying the sink, trying Hana-chan, and hiding every trace of what she had done before her grandparents woke in the morning. She reached for the bathroom light switch. The fluorescent light flickered once before illuminating the room. Minori's eyes were drawn immediately towards the sink. Hana-chan had gone, and the kitchen knife had disappeared with it. A violent jolt of panic shot through her chest. She spun around so quickly that the cup slipped from her fingers, striking the tiled floor and shattering as salt water splashed across her bare feet. Her eyes swept frantically around the small bathroom, behind the shower curtain, in the bath, beneath the sink. Nothing. Her thoughts immediately began searching for an explanation. Had her grandfather woken during the night and found the doll? Had her grandmother come downstairs after hearing a noise? Was that what she had heard while hiding in the attic? Trying to keep her voice steady, she called out just loudly enough to be heard beyond the bathroom door. "Granddad?" She waited. No answer. "Grandma?" The house remained silent. Of course they were asleep. Then, just as she began convincing herself to go upstairs and check on them, another sound drifted through the hallway. The television. The steady hiss of static had changed. At first she thought a late-night program must have interrupted the dead channel, but as she stepped cautiously into the hallway, she realized that wasn't what she was hearing at all. The television was changing channels. Again and again. Very rapidly. The picture flickered so quickly that individual images barely had time to appear before they vanished, replaced by another burst of static, another channel, another fragment of sound. News presenters, commercials, dramas, and blank screens flashed across the television in chaotic succession, while broken pieces of speech bled into one another until they became an incomprehensible stream of distorted voices. Minori found herself moving towards the living room without consciously deciding to. Her grip tightened around the flashlight. Her eyes searched every corner of the hallway, every doorway, every shadow, terrified that she might catch sight of Hana-chan lying somewhere ahead of her. As she reached the living room doorway, the television continued racing through the channels at impossible speed. The voices were still broken apart by the constant interruptions, yet now they no longer sounded random. For the briefest of moments, the words seemed to align. The picture changed. Found. Another channel. Static. You. The words that emerged from the television cut through Minori's thoughts like a knife. I found you. For a heartbeat, she simply stared at the flickering screen, unable to process what she had heard. Then the meaning struck her with terrifying clarity. According to every version of Hitori Kakurenbo she had ever read, once the seeker found the person hiding, the game entered its final stage. The seeker was no longer searching. The seeker was supposed to stab the hider. The panic she had managed to keep under control returned all at once. She had abandoned her hiding place, convinced the ritual had failed, and in doing so, she had ignored the very instructions that people had insisted mattered most. If there was any truth behind what was happening, then she had only one chance to bring it to an end. The ritual instructed the player to find the doll before it found them, spit the salt water over it, pour the remainder across its body, and declare 3 times, "I win." Many of the stories she had read added one final warning, advising that the doll should be burned afterwards to ensure that whatever had entered it could never return. Her first cup of salt water was lying shattered across the bathroom floor. She forced herself to breathe, hurried into the kitchen, and reached for another cup, scattering coarse salt across the worktop as her trembling hands fumbled to prepare the mixture. The moment it was ready, she took a mouthful, fighting the urge to swallow as the sharp taste spread across her tongue, before gripping the cup tightly and setting off through the house. As she searched, she switched on every light she came to, flooding each room with warm yellow light that did little to ease the growing knot in her stomach. Behind her, the television continued to race wildly through its channels, and every few moments, those same broken words drifted through the house, chopped apart by bursts of static before joining together once again. I found you. The sound followed her into the hallway, where the beam of her flashlight caught something scattered across the polished wooden floor. She lowered the light and felt her stomach tighten. A small trail of uncooked rice lay stretching towards the staircase, as though it had been spilled from something being dragged through the house. When she raised the torch again, another detail caught her eye. Resting halfway up one of the steep wooden steps was a short length of red thread. She recognized it instantly. It was the same thread she had wrapped around Hana-chan that afternoon. A harsh scraping noise suddenly echoed from upstairs, startling her so badly that she almost swallowed the salt water by accident. It sounded unmistakably like metal being dragged slowly across wood, and although it lasted only a few seconds before stopping, there was no mistaking where it had come from. Her bedroom. With her heart pounding in her chest, Minori began climbing the narrow staircase as quietly as she could, terrified not only of what might be waiting above, but equally afraid of waking her grandparents. The salt water had become increasingly uncomfortable to hold in her mouth, yet she refused to spit it out. If she had learned anything that night, it was that ignoring the ritual's instructions had brought her nothing but trouble. Halfway up the stairs, the scraping came again, louder now that she was closer. It lasted only a moment before the silence returned, leaving her standing motionless on the landing with the flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. Her bedroom door stood partly open. Moonlight streamed through the window beyond, casting long silver shadows across the floorboards. For a brief moment, the room appeared completely empty, and she almost convinced herself that she had imagined everything. Then she saw it laying on the floor, the kitchen knife that went missing with Hana-chan. The knife moved. It slid across the floor beneath the moonlight as though an unseen hand had pushed it, its blade screeching against the timber before suddenly accelerating straight towards the doorway. Minori lurched backwards with a muffled cry, trapped behind the salt water filling her mouth, and the knife skidded to a stop only inches from her bare foot. She barely looked at it. Her eyes had already found something far more disturbing. Hana-chan was sitting upright in the middle of the bed. The little cloth doll was exactly where she knew she had not left it, its soaked white dress clinging to its body and strands of dark woolen hair hanging untidily across its stitched face. It remained perfectly still, yet somehow gave the unmistakable impression that it had been waiting for her to arrive. Acting on instinct rather than thought, Minori rushed forwards, snatched the doll from the bed, and immediately spat the mouthful of salt water across its face before emptying the rest of the cup over it. Her voice shook as she clutched Hana-chan tightly against her chest, yet she forced the words out exactly as the ritual instructed. "Hana-chan, I win." She repeated them again, louder this time. "I win." Then, with every ounce of conviction she could summon, she declared them one final time. "I win." The effect was immediate. The knife remained exactly where it had fallen, and the unnatural scraping that had echoed through the house ceased as abruptly as it had begun. Downstairs, the television settled onto an ordinary late-night weather and scenery loop, its frantic channel changes disappearing as though they had never happened at all. Minori stood in silence for several moments before finally allowing herself to breathe properly. She switched the television off, returned the knife to the kitchen, cleared away the broken cup from the bathroom floor, and did everything she could to restore the house to the way it had been before the ritual began. As dawn began to brighten the eastern sky, she carried Hana-chan outside and placed the doll inside an old metal bucket before setting it alight. The fire caught quickly enough, but the hours spent submerged in water had left the cloth too damp to burn properly. Although the flames blackened the woolen hair and scorched the little white dress, they refused to consume the doll completely, and after several unsuccessful attempts, she reluctantly buried the charred remains near the edge of the garden, convincing herself that it was better than carrying the doll back inside. Minori never slept that morning. Instead, she spent one final day with her grandparents, smiling through conversations and helping around the house while doing everything she could to push the previous night from her thoughts. By the following afternoon, she was back on the ferry, watching the island disappear behind her before catching the train back to the city and gradually allowing ordinary life to reclaim her attention. For 2 days, she succeeded. Then, early one evening, her grandmother telephoned. The conversation began innocently enough, but before they said goodbye, she asked a question that caused every hair on Minori's body to stand on end. "Did you leave a little doll here?" Her grandmother described it in perfect detail. It was a small cloth doll with dark woolen hair and a little white dress. Minori returned to the island the following weekend without offering any explanation. She retrieved Hana-chan, took the doll home with her, and this time remained beside the fire until every last piece of cloth and thread had been reduced to ash, leaving nothing but charred grains of rice. In the weeks that followed, Minori finally made the decision to share her full experience on the Amazo bulletin board, although she held back just one crucial detail. For her, this missing part of the ritual, which involves 3 specific offerings, was the final summoning link that drew the spirit into the inanimate vessel, and she absolutely would not share that with even a single person, let alone online with hundreds of others. She never visited another paranormal forum after that. The only exception was a single message she posted sometime later. It contained one simple warning. Do not play. Hitori Kakurenbo.